In this video, we're going to create a MVC application. So let's start right away with our ASP.NET Core Web application and hit Next. And we'll call this the MVC app. We'll leave it in the same folder and call this just MVC application. And hit Create. And this time we select Web Application Model View Controller. We leave everything else the same, make sure it's .NET Core 2.2, and hit Create. Now this structure looks a lot more like what you'd expect from an MVC application. We have our controllers, we have our models, and we have our views. We also have our app settings still. And we also have our www root folder with our static files such as CSS, JavaScript, and other libraries we brought in. So let's look at what the differences are with an MVC application. So an MVC application, the front end, the views, are in folder. We have error.cs HTML. How does it know to go there? Well, when it can't find something in the main folder, it goes to the shared folder. I believe it goes to the shared folder second. I'm not positive on that. I have to look at that. But I believe it goes there second. So it looks here first for error. If it can't find it, it looks in shared for error. So that's how it finds that error.cs HTML. So if you're looking at Razor versus MVC already, we'll do a little bit more of a comparison later, but you've got some additional complexity with MVC because MVC is very disconnected between where the code is and where the view is. Those are two different locations. Now the model is just where data lives, and this is a pretty simple model. It has request ID and show request ID. And then we have our views, which again just use the same kind of structure as our Razor pages, where we have just a little bit of HTML code, and then inside the layout file, there's all the rest. So again, instead of MVC app, we can say I am Tim Corey. It's using some of the similar helpers, and we'll cover those helpers again, like I said, in a future video. But this is how an MVC page is laid out. Very, very similar to Razor page. Now, when it comes to the routing of this, the home controller is a default controller. Therefore, it's assumed that it's /home if you don't give it that. So we can specify, well, index is the root domain. So let's look at this if we just run it. It makes it a little easier to see. So once this runs, we'll actually launch these different pages and look at the URL and just see where it takes us. So again, it looks the same as our Razor page. In fact, if I launched one versus the other, you probably couldn't see a difference, except this one says MVC. So notice the URL is empty right now. It has no path after the root domain. If I hit privacy, notice it now says /home/privacy. That's because it says, okay, well, privacy is in the home controller, so therefore we have to parse it out this way. So this is how MVC is a little bit different, is your controller comes first and then your action. And yes, you can change this if you would like, but pretty much that's the standard for how the routing works. Okay, so let's just add a new controller. So new controller, we're going to have an empty MVC controller. Notice there's an API controller as well, because the API works inside of MVC as well, and that's something we can do. We can mix and match these, but we won't, but we can. So now we can just say add, and let's call this controller the demo controller. And it's going to scaffold out a basic controller for us, which will have nothing in it. So it just has this base index. Index is the default if you don't give it a specific action to go to. So if you just said /demo, it's going to assume you meant /demo/index. Again, you can change this, but that's the default. We'll look at those defaults in a minute. But for right now, let's just add another action to our controller. So I will say public iActionResult, and that's our return type, which allows us to return back 400 and 404 and all the rest of the different types easily. It's not ideal because it doesn't give us some of the naming of like what the data type is we're returning. And we'll get to how to do that in a future video. But for right now, we can leave it as iActionResult. And let's give it a name like more info. So if you call the more info action, we're just going to return view. Okay, very, very simple. We're just returning a new view. So what it's going to do is just load the more info page. Well, where is that page? It's nowhere yet. So let's right click on more info and say add view. The view name is more info. The template is, we can create template, a delete, details, edit, empty, or list. This is based upon, it'll scaffold out for you based upon a model that you have, the template for, let's say, create. So to create the form and then say, okay, here's how it lines up with each of your model fields. But we're not going to do that. We're going to create an empty without model template. We're not going to make it a partial view. We're going to use the default layout page. Again, it looks very, very similar to a Razor page creation. Hit add. Watch over here on the right under views. Now we have a demo folder. Inside there, we have a more info folder, which we can spruce this up and just create a new paragraph and say something like, this is more information about this page. Pretty simple stuff. Now let's create one for index as well, just so we have it. And we'll leave all the defaults and hit add. And that will create the index page as well. We'll leave it at just index. Let's launch this, changing nothing else, just adding that controller and those two actions. So there's no URL for it or no menu item for it yet. That's okay. We can say /demo. Demos. Nope, it's demo. So there's our 404 page. There's /demo. And that's index because we did not specify an action. Therefore, we went to the default action, which is index. So the action we want is more info. And this is more info. it's going to assume home. That's not how it works. It's going to say it's going to assume that more info is the controller. So therefore, you have to either specify a controller or assume that it's home/index. Okay? So that's how the routing works, and that's how you set it up. You could change it by changing either this specific route or by adding a new route for something new. For example, in ASP.NET MVC in the full .NET framework, if you're going to add Web API, you'll see another route here that is API, right in here. It'll say API/controller action ID. That way, all of the calls to API go through API and then use the same basic structure. But in our case, we just have MVC. That's how you can change it if you want to. So that's a very basic, high-level overview of how to get started in MVC application in .NET Core. In the next video, we're going to cover the API that you can also use as the web project type. After that, we'll come back and talk about when you would use each type.